Imagine you are a 17th century scientist, perhaps a natural philosopher as they called themselves then. You have just made a startling discovery about the behavior of light or the motion of planets. How do you tell anyone? You write a letter. You send it to a colleague in Paris, or Leiden, or London. You wait weeks for a reply. If you are lucky, that colleague shares your letter with others who share it with others still. And slowly, painfully, your discovery makes its way into the world. Now contrast that with today. A researcher in Seoul uploads a preprint at midnight, and by morning, scientists in Sao Paulo, Oslo, and Nairobi have read it, commented on it, and begun citing it in their own work. That shift from handwritten letters passed between wealthy gentlemen scholars to instantaneous global digital exchange is what this course is about. Welcome to Scholarly Communication Then and Now. This lecture series is built on Chapter 9 of Johnson and colleagues' Fundamentals of Collection Development and Management, a foundational library science text first published in 2005. But we have updated every major topic with the most current scholarship, policy developments, and data available through 2025, because scholarly communication doesn't stand still, and neither can we. Over the next 17 segments, we are going to explore how knowledge is created, validated, shared, preserved, and accessed. We will trace the history of scholarly publishing from those 17th century learned societies all the way to the era of artificial intelligence and open mandates. We will examine the economics, the politics, the technology, and the very human stakes involved in who gets to publish, who gets to read, and who bears the cost. Whether you are entering the profession as a new MLIS student or you have been working in libraries for years, this material sits at the very heart of what we do. Libraries are in the knowledge business, and right now, that business is being transformed in ways we could not have imagined even a decade ago. So let's begin. Before we can talk about what is changing in scholarly communication, we need to be precise about what we are actually talking about. And in library science, that precision matters because the words scholarship, scholarly communication system, and scholarly publishing are often used interchangeably, when in fact they refer to meaningfully different things. Let's start with the most fundamental concept, scholarship. Scholarship is the craft of learning and teaching. It encompasses research, creative expression, and the broader intellectual life of a discipline. It is what scholars do. It is how they think, investigate, and produce new knowledge. Scholarly communication is one step more specific. It is the process of disseminating that research, of moving it from the mind and notebook of a researcher into the world, and then providing continuing access to it as part of the scholarly record. Think of it as the circulatory system of knowledge. Just as blood carries oxygen through a body, scholarly communication carries ideas through the intellectual community. Now, the scholarly communication system, and this is the term that library professionals use most precisely, refers to the entire ecosystem of interactions among everyone who creates, transforms, distributes, collects, preserves, makes available, and uses research. That means researchers and scientists, yes, but also yes, editors, peer reviewers, publishers, librarians, university administrators, funding agencies, and ultimately the readers, students, practitioners, policymakers, the curious public. And finally, scholarly publishing, which is what most people outside librarianship think of first, is just one subset of all these activities. It is, as Carla Hahn defines it, communication activity mediated through a durable medium to fix knowledge. The key word there is fix, to make a permanent, citable, retrievable record of a claim or a finding. Why does this distinction matter for librarians? Because libraries are not just in the business of acquiring published journals and books. Libraries sit at the intersection of every part of this system. We select and acquire resources, yes, but we also facilitate discovery, support access and dissemination, archive and preserve content, and support our users as they navigate this ecosystem. When any part of the system changes, and it is changing dramatically, every one of those library functions is affected. It is also worth noting that the digital revolution has expanded what counts as scholarly communication beyond formal publication. Today, scholars communicate through email threads and preprint servers, through blog posts and social media, through lab notebooks and data repositories, through conference presentations live streamed to thousands. The boundary between informal communication and the formal record is blurring. And that has profound implications for how we as librarians think about our role. To understand where scholarly communication is going, we need to understand where it came from. And it's a story that is simultaneously more interesting and more troubling than most people realize. Our story begins in the 1600s, in the drawing rooms and meeting halls of European learned societies. The Royal Society of London, the Académie des Sciences in Paris, the Accademia dei Lincei in Rome, these were clubs for the intellectual elite. Their purpose was to provide a forum where independent scholars could share and discuss their research. And when these societies began publishing their findings in serial periodicals, the Philosophical Transactions, the Comptes Rendus, the Abhandlungen, scholarly publishing was born. Notice something important about this original system. The creators of scholarship and the consumers of scholarship were essentially the same people. Wealthy, educated gentlemen who could afford both the time to conduct research and the money to subscribe to journals. There were almost no middlemen. When the Royal Society published a paper, it was publishing the work of its own members for its own members. Quality control happened because your peers, people you knew personally, were the ones vetting your work. That's the origin of peer review. This relatively intimate system began to change in the United States with the Morrill Act of 1862, which established federal funding for land-grant universities. Suddenly, research was no longer just the hobby of wealthy elites. It was a civic obligation. Universities were mandated to produce knowledge that would benefit society, and they did. Publication volumes exploded. After the Second World War, things escalated even further. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to universities. The federal government began pouring money into scientific research at an unprecedented scale. The volume of scholarly publication grew exponentially. And professional societies, which had been publishing journals as a service to their members, often at cost, simply could not keep up. They turned to commercial publishers to handle the growth. And this is where the story takes a turn. Commercial publishers were not interested in publishing as a service. They were interested in publishing as a business. They recognized immediately that they controlled something extraordinarily valuable, unique content with guaranteed institutional demand. Libraries had to buy these journals. There were no substitutes, so prices rose. And rose again. And consolidated publishers bought up smaller ones and raised prices further. By the 1980s, academic libraries were in crisis. They were spending more and more of their budgets on serial subscriptions and getting less and less in return because price increases outpaced budget increases year after year. Books got cut first. University presses, which had once been willing to publish important but low-selling scholarly monographs as a service to their disciplines, started being pressured by their parent universities to turn a profit. Many presses closed. Many scholars in the humanities for whom the monograph is the primary form of scholarly output, found themselves with nowhere to publish. Understanding this history is not just a historical exercise, it is the backdrop against which everything that follows, open access, institutional repositories, funder mandates, makes sense. The system we are trying to reform was not designed. It evolved through specific historical circumstances, and the pressures it created on libraries and scholars are still very much with us today. By the 1980s, librarians had a phrase for what was happening, the serials crisis. And it was an apt name. Serials, meaning journals, periodicals, continuing publications, were becoming unaffordable. Libraries were canceling subscriptions. Faculty were losing access to the literature they needed to do their work, and the budgetary math was brutal. Journal prices were growing at 3 to 4 times the rate of inflation year after year, with no end in sight. Initially, the problem was framed as the library's problem. After all, it was librarians who were crying wolf at budget meetings. Faculty, who received journals for free as perquisites of their positions, often didn't fully grasp the financial reality. University administrators tended to view it as a procurement challenge rather than a systemic crisis. But over time, and through sustained advocacy by library organizations like the Association of Research Libraries, the conversation shifted. Librarians helped people understand that this wasn't really a library problem. It was a scholarly communication problem. The system by which knowledge moved from researchers to readers was fundamentally broken, and the brokenness was structural, not incidental. So, what does that system look like today, in 2025? In some ways, the picture is even starker. The so-called Big Five publishers, Elsevier, Springer Nature, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and the American Chemical Society, now publish or control roughly 56% of all scholarly articles worldwide. Think about that. More than half the world's research output flows through 5 companies. In any other industry, that level of concentration would trigger antitrust scrutiny. The average article processing charge globally is now around $1,600. But that's the average. At the prestigious end of the market, a Nature journal might charge $10,000 or more to make a single article open access. And these costs, when borne by institutions through transformative agreement, which we'll discuss later, often end up being larger than the subscription costs they replaced. Meanwhile, library budgets have not kept pace. Some major research libraries have seen their collection budgets reduced by $1 million or more in recent years, even as the volume of published research continues to grow. The result is an increasingly paradoxical situation. There is more research being published than ever before, and less institutional access to it than there could be. New problems have also emerged since 2005. Predatory publishing, journals that charge authors article processing fees while providing little or no actual peer review or editorial infrastructure, has become a significant quality control problem. So-called paper mills produce fabricated research wholesale, corrupting the scholarly record. And the rise of artificial intelligence tools is raising entirely new questions about authorship, integrity, and what it even means to conduct original research. The serials crisis of the 1980s did not end. It transformed. And understanding that transformation is essential for anyone who works in or around the scholarly publishing ecosystem today. December 2001, Budapest, Hungary. A small but influential group of scholars, librarians, technologists, and philanthropists gathers for an international conference convened by the Open Society Institute, the organization founded by George Soros to promote open societies worldwide. They are there to talk about a radical idea. What if peer-reviewed research were freely available to everyone on the internet, without subscription fees, without paywalls, without barriers of any kind? The gathering was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of growing frustration among researchers who knew that their own work they had done, work that had been peer-reviewed by their colleagues without payment, work they had transferred the copyright of to commercial publishers, was being locked behind subscription walls that many of their own institutions could no longer afford. It was a peculiar irony. The people who created the knowledge couldn't always access it. 2 months after the Budapest meeting, on February 14, 2002, the Budapest Open Access Initiative released its statement, and it was historic, not just as a policy document, but as a moment of naming. This was the first time anyone had publicly used the term open access in a formal, movement-defining context. It was the first time anyone had called for both open access journals and open access archives as complementary and equally important strategies. And it came with something that earlier discussions had lacked: significant funding to turn ideas into action. The Budapest definition of open access is worth understanding precisely. It describes free availability on the public internet, permitting any user to read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, or link to the full texts of articles, with no financial, legal, or technical barriers, other than those inseparable from gaining access to the internet itself. The only constraint on reproduction and distribution should be to give authors control over the integrity of their work and the right to be properly acknowledged and cited. That's it. Free to read, free to use, free to build on. 2 further declarations followed in rapid succession: the Bethesda Statement on Open Access Publishing in June 2003 and the Berlin Declaration on Open Access to Knowledge in the Sciences and Humanities in October 2003. Both offered the same precise 2-part definition. First, the author grants all users a free, irrevocable worldwide right to access, copy, use, and distribute the work for any responsible purpose. Second, a complete version of the work is deposited immediately upon publication in a supported open access repository. If you've heard of what's sometimes called the BOAI definition or the BBB definition, Budapest, Bethesda, Berlin, this is what people are referring to. The Berlin Declaration has now been signed by more than 600 institutions worldwide, universities, academies of science, national libraries, research funding agencies. When you hear about Plan S in Europe or the OSTP Nelson memo in the United States or Harvard's faculty open access policy, all of these trace their philosophical lineage back to these 3 foundational documents from 2002 and 2003. One thing that often surprises students is how clear and unambiguous these definitions are. Open access doesn't mean free to read, but not to reuse. It doesn't mean free with a 12-month embargo. It doesn't mean free for non-commercial use only. Real open access, by the Budapest definition, means immediate, unrestricted, perpetual availability with attribution. That definitional clarity has become the standard against which every subsequent policy is measured. Here's something that might surprise you. The formal promotion and tenure system in American universities is less than 100 years old. We tend to think of it as an ancient institution, as permanent and immovable as tenure itself. But it's not. It was invented to solve a specific problem. And understanding that problem helps us understand why changing it is so difficult. In 1915, the American Association of University Professors was founded and issued its Declaration of Principles. The context was important. Faculty members at that time could be fired by trustees and university presidents for what they taught, what they said, and what they published. Academic freedom was not protected. The AAUP's solution was peer review, not of publications but of personnel. Only committees of fellow faculty members, the AAUP argued, were qualified to judge the work of another faculty member. That was the origin of the modern tenure system. After the Second World War, when the GI Bill created massive faculty shortages, universities began formalizing tenure as a benefit and creating official processes for promotion review. And publication, specifically peer-reviewed publication, became the primary currency of scholarly productivity. Why? Because it was visible, quantifiable, comparable across institutions. You could count articles. You could rank journals by prestige. You could tell at a glance whether someone had published with Oxford University Press or a vanity press. The problem is that this system, designed in the mid-20th century, is now propping up an economic structure that actively works against the scholarly values it was meant to protect. Faculty want to publish in the most prestigious journals. The most prestigious journals are often the most expensive. The more expensive the journals, the more libraries struggle to maintain subscriptions. The fewer subscriptions, the less access to research. And yet faculty continue to publish where the prestige is because their careers depend on it. Research conducted by the University of California in 2006 found that 70% of faculty expected their publishing practices to remain largely unchanged, and most were still readily transferring their copyrights to publishers. More striking still, a survey found that while 90% of authors signed copyright transfer agreements, 61% thought they still owned their copyright afterward. They had signed something they didn't fully understand, giving away rights they thought they still had. By 2025, this picture has changed, but not as much as reformers had hoped. Open access publications are now formally recognized in tenure guidelines at many institutions. Preprints are increasingly cited and credited. Altmetrics, measures of online engagement, downloads, and social impact, are being used alongside traditional citation counts. Some institutions explicitly reward open scholarship practices, and yet surveys consistently show that junior faculty remain risk-averse when it comes to new publication venues. The fear of being perceived as publishing in less prestigious outlets is real, and it is career consequential. Until promotion and tenure committees genuinely value open access publications equally, and until that valuation is codified in institutional policies, the structural incentives of the system will continue to resist change. The currency of the academic economy is still the prestige journal, and changing a currency requires changing the entire monetary system. Let me tell you about something that happens thousands of times every day, all over the world, in the offices of professors and researchers. An author finishes a paper. They submit it to a journal. The journal accepts it, and then, before the paper is published, they receive a document called a copyright transfer agreement. Most authors sign it without reading it carefully, and in doing so, they give away rights that will significantly limit what they can do with their own work for the rest of their lives. This is not a small problem. A 2003 survey called the Romeo Study found that 90% of responding authors had assigned their copyright to publishers. That part is perhaps expected. But here's the astonishing part. 61% of those same authors still believed they owned their copyright. They had signed away their rights without realizing it. They assumed they could still post their articles on their course websites, distribute copies to students, share papers with colleagues. Often, legally, they could not. They had transferred those rights to a publisher. So, what rights are we talking about? Copyright law in the United States and in most countries gives the creator of a work a bundle of exclusive rights. The right to reproduce the work, to prepare derivative works, to distribute copies, to display the work publicly. When you assign your copyright to a publisher, you are handing over that entire bundle. The publisher then has the legal authority to determine where, how, and at what price your work can be accessed. The good news is that copyright is not a monolithic thing. You don't have to transfer all of it. Copyright consists of individually separable rights, and you can negotiate to transfer only some of them. For example, you might transfer the right of first publication to the journal, which is what they really need, while retaining the rights to post your paper on your institutional website, to deposit it in a repository, to distribute it in your classes, and to use it in future work. One of the most practical tools for doing this is called an author addendum, a short legal document that you attach to the publisher's standard copyright transfer agreement, modifying it to specify which rights you are retaining. The Spark Author Addendum, developed by the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, is a widely used example. It has been drafted by lawyers and is designed to be legally enforceable. Many publishers, when authors actually ask to negotiate, will agree to modified terms. The key is that you have to ask. Creative Commons licenses are another important tool in this toolkit. Developed by a non-profit organization, Creative Commons offers a set of standardized license types that allow creators to specify exactly how their work may be used, with attribution for non-commercial purposes only, with or without the right to create derivative works. The most open license, CC-BY, meaning attribution required, is the license of choice for most open access mandates, including Plan S. The implications for librarians are significant. One of the most impactful services an academic librarian can provide is copyright education for faculty, helping authors understand what they're signing, what they can retain, and how to use addenda and open licenses is not a fringe activity. It is central to advancing the open access mission, because the single biggest obstacle to open access is not technology or funding. It's the routine, unreflective transfer of intellectual property by the people who created it. When people talk about open access, they often speak as if it were a single thing. It's not. In 2025, there are at least 5 distinct models of open access, each with different mechanisms, different cost structures, and this is the part that matters most for equity. Very different implications for who can afford to publish and who can afford to read. Let's walk through them. The first, and currently the dominant model, is Gold Open Access. In the Gold model, an article is published directly in a fully open access journal, meaning the journal itself does not charge subscription fees to readers. To sustain itself, the journal typically charges the author, or more often, the author's institution or funding agency, an article processing charge, or APC. Gold. OA journals include flagship publications like PLOS One, eLife, and PeerJ. As of 2024, roughly 45% of all open access articles appear in Gold journals. The growth rate has been remarkable, approximately 16% per year over the past decade. The second model is hybrid open access, and this one generates the most controversy. In the hybrid model, a journal is primarily subscription-based, but individual articles can be made open access by paying an APC. The argument is that this gives authors flexibility. They can publish in prestigious subscription journals and still comply with open access mandates. The problem critics point to is what's called double dipping. The publisher collects subscription fees from libraries and article processing charges from authors. effectively charging twice for the same content. Libraries have pushed back hard on this, and hybrid OA is being phased out in some transformative agreements. Third is green open access, self-archiving. In the green model, the article is published in a traditional subscription journal, and the author separately deposits a version of the manuscript, either a preprint before peer review or a postprint after, in a freely accessible repository. Green OA is free for the author, which makes it particularly equitable. The catch is that many publishers impose embargo periods, 12, 24, sometimes 36 months, during which the self-archived version cannot be made publicly available. Green OA also tends to have lower discovery and visibility than gold, since the article isn't natively open in the journal itself. Fourth is diamond open access. And this is the model that many equity-focused scholars argue is the most promising long-term alternative. In the diamond model, there are no fees to authors and no subscription fees to readers. The journal is sustained entirely by institutional subsidies, learned society support, library consortia contributions, or grants. As of 2025, approximately 69% of journals listed in the directory of open access journals are diamond, but they represent only about 35% of open access articles, because diamond journals tend to be smaller. The financial model is the challenge. Diamond OA requires ongoing institutional commitment rather than a self-sustaining revenue stream. Finally, bronze open access, arguably not truly open access at all. Bronze refers to content that is freely readable on a publisher's website, but without any open license attached. That means readers can read the article, but they cannot legally download, redistribute, or reuse it without publisher permission. Bronze is declining as funder mandates increasingly require Creative Commons licensing, but it still represents a significant portion of apparently free content online. Understanding these distinctions matters enormously for practical library work. When a researcher comes to you saying they need to publish open access to comply with their NIH grant, you need to know which model satisfies the mandate and which ones don't. Gold and green generally do, under specific conditions. Bronze usually does not. And diamond, if you can find a suitable diamond journal in the researcher's field, is often the best option of all. Numbers can be dry, but sometimes the right numbers tell a story so vividly that they don't need any embellishment. Let me share a few. In March 2008, just 17 years ago, the directory of open access journals listed approximately 3,200 journals as fully open access. In 2025, that number has grown to more than 22,000. That's nearly a seven-fold increase. Open access is not a niche phenomenon. It is increasingly the mainstream. When the textbook we're drawing on was published in 2005, Biomed Central was charging article processing fees of around $1,700. The Public Library of Science charged $2,000 to $2,500. These numbers seemed high at the time. Today, they seem almost quaint. The average APC globally is now around $1,600, but that average obscures enormous variation. At the low end, many diamond OA journals charge nothing. At the high end, a Nature journal might charge $10,000 or more per article for a single paper. This APC inflation is one of the defining tensions of the current open access landscape. In theory, APCs solve the access problem. Readers get free access. In practice, they create a new inequity. Wealthy, well-funded researchers at well-resourced institutions can afford to publish open access. Researchers in the Global South, independent scholars, those working in underfunded disciplines, they face a publish or pay choice that can effectively exclude them from the most visible journals. The response to this has come on multiple fronts. transformative agreements in which libraries pay publishers a negotiated sum that covers both reading rights and APC costs for affiliated authors, are now in place at hundreds of institutions worldwide. Funder programs like Plan S in Europe and the OSTP mandate in the United States require open access, but also acknowledge the need to support APC costs for funded researchers. And waivers and discounts from publishers, while inconsistent and sometimes difficult to navigate, do exist. It's also worth noting what has changed in terms of quality perception. In 2005, faculty were deeply skeptical of open access journals. They worried that free journals must be lower quality, that peer review would be less rigorous, that prestige would be absent. Those concerns have not entirely disappeared, but the evidence has shifted the conversation. PLOS1, launched in 2006, became the world's largest scientific journal. eLife, launched in 2012 with Wellcome Trust and Howard Hughes Medical Institute funding, publishes work of the highest quality. The correlation between subscription model and quality, which was always more assumed than demonstrated, has been increasingly shown to be false. The challenge for 2025 and beyond is ensuring that the shift to open access publishing doesn't simply replace one inequitable system with another, that it doesn't create a world where only the well-funded can publish and everyone else is relegated to preprint servers and diamond journals with limited visibility. That is a design challenge, not a technological one. If the transition to open access has been difficult for journals, it has been even more complicated for books. And this matters enormously for anyone working with humanities and social sciences scholars, where the monograph, the scholarly book, remains the primary form of intellectual output and the most heavily weighted factor in promotion and tenure. Think about the economics of the scholarly monograph. A publisher invests in acquiring the manuscript, having it peer-reviewed, editing it, typesetting it, marketing it, and distributing it. The market for an academic monograph, a specialized study of, say, 16th century Flemish trading networks, might be a few hundred libraries worldwide. With print runs of 500 or fewer, the per unit cost is enormous. The book might retail for $150 and still barely cover costs. When the textbook we're using was written in 2005, the landscape for open access monographs was extremely limited. The National Academies Press was a genuine pioneer, making all of its publications freely available page by page online, while still selling print copies. The Gutenberg Project, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and run through Columbia University Press, was converting prize-winning history dissertations into electronic monographs. Both initiatives were fascinating experiments in what might be possible. The Gutenberg story is instructive precisely because of how it ended. By late 2007, the 36 Gutenberg titles became open access, not as a triumphant expansion of the program, but because the original financial model had collapsed. The costs of preparing electronic scholarly monographs for online publication were not sustainable without ongoing external support. This was an early lesson in a challenge that remains very much alive today. Open access for books requires a funding model that doesn't depend entirely on per-copy sales, and building that model is genuinely hard. 2 decades on, however, the landscape has changed substantially. Open book publishers in the UK, the Library of Congress, Lever Press, Luminos from the University of California Press, the OEPEN Foundation in the Netherlands, these organizations have developed workable, if not always easily replicable models for open access monographs. The Knowledge Unlatched program has allowed libraries to collectively fund open access for specific titles. And the emergence of book processing charges, BPCs, mirrors the APC model for journals, allowing authors or their funders to pay for open access publication of entire books. In 2024, UK Research and Innovation formally extended its open access mandate to include long-form outputs, monographs, book chapters, edited volumes. This is a significant development. It means that researchers funded by UK government money will increasingly be required to make their books open access, not just their articles. The United States is watching this development closely, and it is likely that similar requirements will follow. For librarians, the key takeaway is that the open access monograph is no longer a utopian idea. It is an emerging reality with real infrastructure behind it. But that infrastructure is uneven. The economics are still being worked out, and the humanities scholars who depend on monographs for their careers deserve librarians who can help them navigate the options. Long before anyone coined the term open access, scientists were doing something that, in retrospect, was quietly revolutionary. They were posting their papers online themselves. In the 1980s, computer scientists were uploading preprints to anonymous FTP sites, the primitive file transfer systems that preceded the web. High-energy physicists took this further in 1991 when Paul Ginsparg, then at Los Alamos National Laboratory, launched what became known as rArXiv, now hosted at Cornell University. The basic idea was simple. Before you submit your paper to a journal, post a version of it here, where everyone can read it for free. No embargo, no paywall, no waiting for the slow machinery of formal publication. The physics community embraced this instantly. Within a few years, it was inconceivable to work in high-energy physics without reading rArXiv. Today, rArXiv holds more than 2.4 million papers spanning physics, mathematics, computer science, quantitative biology, economics, and statistics. Many of the most significant scientific papers of the last 3 decades appeared first on rArXiv, sometimes months or years before they appeared in peer-reviewed journals. This model, what we call self-archiving or green open access, was formally theorized and championed by Stephen Harnad, who in 1995 published what he called a subversive proposal that researchers in all disciplines should immediately post their papers in open online archives. It was subversive because it challenged the business model of commercial publishers. It was a proposal because outside of physics and a few other fields, almost nobody was doing it. Harnad spent decades advocating for universal self-archiving as the fastest, cheapest route to open access. The institutional infrastructure to support self-archiving didn't fully develop until the early 2000s. 2 critical pieces of software were released: ePrints from the University of Southampton in September 2000 and DSpace from MIT in November 2002. These open source platforms allowed universities to set up their own digital repositories, places to collect, preserve, and make accessible the research output of their faculty. SPARC, the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, released guidance for developing these institutional repositories in 2002. The growth since then has been remarkable. In March 2008, there were roughly 1,000 repositories worldwide. Today, there are more than 6,000. And the content of those repositories has diversified well beyond journal articles. Datasets, software, theses and dissertations, multimedia, technical reports, gray literature. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated another dimension of self-archiving, the preprint explosion. bioRxiv, launched in 2013 for biology, and medRxiv, launched in 2019 for health sciences, became central to how the scientific community communicated during the pandemic. Papers describing early vaccine trials, transmission dynamics, and clinical findings appeared on these servers days after experiments concluded, weeks or months before they could go through formal peer review. This was invaluable for the speed of the pandemic response, and it permanently shifted norms around preprints in medicine and biology. For librarians, the practical implications touch several areas, helping faculty understand their self-archiving rights, particularly which version of a paper they can deposit and when, is an increasingly common reference and instruction function. Administering and populating institutional repositories is a major ongoing project at most research libraries. And thinking carefully about preservation, because a repository that doesn't last is not truly serving the scholarly record, is a professional responsibility that sits squarely with us. Ideas change culture slowly. Policies change behavior quickly. And nowhere is that distinction more apparent than in the history of open access mandates. For years, after the Budapest Open Access Initiative, open access remained largely voluntary. Researchers who cared about it published in open access journals or self-archived their work. Researchers who didn't simply continued with business as usual. Surveys consistently showed low compliance rates. Because why would you change your publishing habits if you didn't have to? The first crack in this voluntary consensus came in the United States from an unexpected direction, the National Institutes of Health. In 2005, the NIH introduced a voluntary public access policy, asking funded researchers to deposit their papers in PubMed Central, the NIH's open digital archive of biomedical literature. Compliance was abysmal, less than 5%. The policy was essentially ignored. But in 2007, something changed. Congress, through the Consolidated Appropriations Act, made the policy mandatory. Effective May 2008, any investigator funded by the NIH was required to deposit peer-reviewed manuscripts in PubMed Central no later than 12 months after publication. Compliance was now a statutory requirement, not a polite suggestion. At the time, this was described by scholars Ray English and Heather Joseph as the largest open access policy in the world, covering $29 billion per year in research and producing approximately 80,000 peer-reviewed journal articles annually. That was a pivotal moment. But the story didn't end there. In 2023, the NIH strengthened its mandate dramatically. The 12-month embargo was eliminated. All NIH-funded research must now be immediately open access upon publication. No waiting period. Immediately. In the same period, Harvard University made history of its own. In February 2008, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences voted unanimously to grant the university a non-exclusive license to distribute their scholarly articles in an open access repository managed by the library. This was the first institutional mandate of its kind at a major American university, and it sent a signal around the academic world. Within years, hundreds of universities adopted similar policies. In Europe, the landscape shifted in 2018 with the launch of Plan S. Plan S was initiated by a coalition of European research funders, including the Wellcome Trust, the European Research Council, and major national research councils, and it set a hard deadline. From 2021, all research funded by coalition members must be published in open access journals or platforms with Creative Commons attribution licensing immediately upon publication. No embargo. No hybrid model without a transformative agreement. Plan S was controversial. It put enormous pressure on publishers and raised legitimate concerns about IPC costs. But it changed the negotiating dynamic between libraries and publishers fundamentally. And then, in 2022, the United States federal government took its most sweeping action yet. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, issued what's now known as the Nelson Memo, directing all federal agencies to require immediate open access for all publications and data resulting from federally funded research. This phased in between 2023 and 2026 across all agencies. This is the largest open access policy in history. Full stop. covering the entirety of U.S. federal research funding. For librarians, these mandates create both opportunity and obligation. Opportunity, because they give us leverage in conversations with researchers who have previously been resistant to open access. When it's required by their funder, the conversation changes. Obligation, because helping researchers understand and comply with these mandates is now a core library service function. That means staying current on which mandates apply to which grants, which repositories satisfy which requirements, and how copyright agreements need to be negotiated to permit compliance. When institutional repositories first emerged in the early 2000s, the hopes attached to them were enormous. Clifford Lynch, writing in 2003, described a fully realized institutional repository as a kind of comprehensive intellectual memory of a university, capturing not just research publications but teaching materials, student work, administrative records, event documentation, experimental data, the full living record of the institution's intellectual life. He thought it could be an engine of change for higher education and for the scholarly communication system. That vision was inspirational. The reality has been more complicated, and studying that gap between vision and reality is one of the most instructive exercises in the field. By March 2008, there were approximately 1,000 institutional repositories worldwide, a remarkable growth from zero in 1999. The software infrastructure was maturing. ePrints and DSpace, the two dominant open source platforms, powered nearly half of all repositories. Spark had published guidance for building and managing them. The institutional repository seemed like a success story in progress. But then, researchers started looking carefully at what was actually in these repositories. A major study by Kat McDowell, published in 2007, found that approximately 41% of content in American academic institutional repositories was student-produced, mostly electronic theses and dissertations. Only 37% was faculty scholarly output. And of that, only about 13% was peer-reviewed work. Remember, scholarly works, specifically peer-reviewed faculty research, were the primary content that institutional repositories had been designed to collect. McDowell's conclusion was blunt. It is doubtful that institutional repositories will prove to alleviate the crisis in scholarly communication, at least in the way we initially expected. The great irony was that the faculty whose research was supposed to fill these repositories were often the hardest group to engage. 63% of ARL member libraries reported that recruiting faculty content was either somewhat difficult or very difficult. Why? Several reasons. Faculty were concerned about copyright, often incorrectly, since most publishers allowed self-archiving of postprints in institutional repositories. They were concerned about quality perceptions. Would depositing work in a repository make it look like they couldn't get it published in a real journal? They were concerned about effort. Depositing takes time, and time is a scarce resource for researchers, and many simply didn't see the relevance. If Google Scholar could find their work, why did a repository matter? In 2025, the picture has improved, though the challenges haven't gone away. There are now more than 6,000 repositories worldwide. Funder mandates, particularly the NIH and OSTP requirements, have driven significant increases in deposits because researchers now have external requirements compelling them to self-archive. Repositories have expanded their content scope to include datasets, software, gray literature, and multimedia. ORCID integration has made author disambiguation and attribution much more reliable, and AI tools are beginning to assist with metadata creation and ingest, reducing one of the friction points that discouraged faculty. But long-term sustainability remains a genuine concern. A repository that a library can no longer afford to maintain is not truly serving the scholarly record. Preservation, not just storage, but active ongoing commitment to format, migration, and bitstream integrity requires resources and expertise that not every institution has. And the question of what an institutional repository uniquely offers in a world of discipline-based repositories like Archive and PubMed Central, and commercial academic networks like academia.edu and ResearchGate, is one that repository managers are still working to answer. If you could go back in time and show the attendees of the 2001 Budapest meeting what scholarly communication would look like in 2025, there are two developments they probably couldn't have anticipated. The first is the explosive rise of artificial intelligence tools that are reshaping every stage of the research life cycle. The second is the structural transformation in how libraries pay for scholarly content through what we call transformative agreements. Let's take each in turn. The AI revolution in scholarly communication is moving so fast that it's genuinely difficult to characterize it without being either alarmist or naive. The capabilities are remarkable. Large language models can assist with literature reviews, help non-native speakers write more fluently, generate research summaries, suggest analytical frameworks, semantic scholar, illicit, consensus, and similar tools are changing how researchers discover and synthesize literature. For people who are early in their research careers, who are still learning how fields are structured and what the important debates are, these tools can genuinely accelerate learning, but the risks are equally significant. Language models hallucinate. They generate plausible sounding but fabricated citations and claims with alarming frequency. Researchers who use AI tools without careful verification risk introducing errors into their work and then citing those errors in others' work, contaminating the scholarly record. There are already documented cases of legal briefs, medical reviews, and scientific papers containing citations to papers that do not exist. The authorship question is thornier still. Who is the author of a paper if an AI wrote significant portions of the text? What does peer review mean if reviewers cannot distinguish AI generated from human generated prose? Most major journals now require authors to disclose any use of AI tools in manuscript preparation. Some journals ban AI authorship entirely, but enforcement is effectively impossible and the norms are still being negotiated in real time. Meanwhile, the legal landscape is shifting. Anthropic, OpenAI, and other AI companies are facing major copyright lawsuits from publishers, authors, and news organizations who argue that training these models on copyrighted content without permission or compensation constitutes infringement. The outcomes of these cases will profoundly shape what AI companies can do and how scholarly content can be used to train future models. Now, transformative agreements. This is the mechanism through which the library community has been trying to shift the economics of publishing without simply waiting for publishers to change voluntarily. A transformative agreement, sometimes called a read and publish or publish and read deal, is a contract between a library or library consortium and a publisher that bundles together reading rights, traditional subscriptions, and publishing rights, open access article processing charges, into a single negotiated payment. The theory is elegant. Instead of paying for subscriptions on one hand and APCs on the other, institutions pay one consolidated fee. And in exchange, their affiliated researchers can publish open access without any additional per article cost. Over time, as more content becomes open access, the subscription component shrinks and the publishing component grows. Hence the term transformative. In practice, transformative agreements have spread rapidly. There are now hundreds of such deals worldwide, covering major publishers including Elsevier, Springer Nature, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and many others. For researchers at institutions with these agreements, publishing open access has become seamless. They just check a box, and their institution covers the cost. But the critics raise legitimate concerns. In many cases, The total cost to institutions has increased under transformative agreements, not decreased. The benefit, open access, is real, but so is the price. And for institutions without the negotiating leverage or budget to participate in these deals, the inequity between well-resourced and less well-resourced institutions grows wider. Transformative agreements may be transitional rather than transformative in the deepest sense. Throughout this lecture series, we've been talking about scholarly communication as a system that is being disrupted, reformed, and reinvented. But systems don't transform themselves, people transform them. And librarians, specifically collections librarians and subject liaisons, are in a uniquely powerful position to drive that transformation. Let me walk through the 6 key roles that collections librarians play in the evolving scholarly communication landscape. None of these is entirely new, but each has been deepened and extended by the changes we've been discussing. The first role is supporting open access models through selection and acquisition. This means applying the same rigorous evaluation criteria you would apply to any resource: quality, relevance, sustainability, pricing, to OA publications. It means seeking out publishers that offer diamond or gold OA as part of your collection strategy, not treating them as an afterthought. It means negotiating transformative agreements or supporting your library's participation in consortium level negotiations, because those deals directly affect what your researchers can publish and where. The second role is developing and managing institutional repository content. This has evolved significantly from the early days of IRs. Today, it means actively soliciting deposits from faculty, not just putting up a website and hoping people come, but building relationships, understanding workflows, and making the deposit process as frictionless as possible. It means developing policies that clearly define what belongs in the repository and communicating those policies to the community. And it means thinking about IR content in relationship to other repositories, knowing when PubMed Central or RR better serves a particular researcher's needs. The third role is fostering easy access. This is the technical and system side of scholarly communication librarianship. Link resolvers that take researchers from a citation to the full text. A to Z journal lists that surface OA alternatives. Discovery systems that integrate open access content alongside licensed resources seamlessly. OAIPMH harvesting infrastructure that makes your repository's content discoverable by Google Scholar and other aggregators. These are not glamorous responsibilities, but they are foundational to whether open access actually works in practice. The fourth role is preserving digital content. And this is one where collections librarians need to be genuinely proactive, not reactive. Digital content is fragile in ways that print is not. File formats become obsolete, storage media fails. Servers get decommissioned when grants run out. The collections librarian needs to ensure that resources are stored with redundancy, that format migration plans exist, and that preservation commitments are written into licensing agreements. Participation in shared preservation networks like LocSS, ClockSS, and Portico is part of this picture for library licensed content. For IR content, it means having explicit preservation policies and the infrastructure to back them up. The fifth role, outreach and liaison activities, is arguably the most human-centered. This is where you sit down with a faculty member before they submit their next paper and help them understand what their copyright transfer agreement actually says. This is where you explain the difference between posting to academia.edu, which you don't own, and depositing in your institution's repository, which ensures long-term access. This is where you help a junior researcher understand their NIH mandate and how to comply with it without jeopardizing their relationship with their preferred journal. The sixth role is engaging in public policy and legal matters. This is the macro level. It means staying current on funder mandates. And there are a lot of them now, and they are changing frequently. It means understanding copyright law well enough to advise faculty, even if you are careful never to provide formal legal advice. It means engaging with professional organizations like ILA, ACRL, and ARL, which advocate for library interests in legislative and regulatory proceedings. And it means voting with your acquisitions budget, favoring publishers and platforms whose policies support open access and author rights. The arc of this work is long, but every individual interaction, every faculty member who understands their rights, every paper that gets deposited, every student who learns to find the open access version of a paper instead of hitting a paywall, that's the work of transforming scholarly communication. And it happens at the reference desk, in the liaison office, and in the collection spreadsheet every single day. We've spent a lot of time in this lecture series talking about the arguments for open access, the equity arguments, the economic arguments, the philosophical arguments about publicly funded research belonging to the public. But arguments are one thing, evidence is another. So let's look at what the data actually shows. The most consistent and compelling finding in open access research is what's called the citation advantage. Open access articles, those freely available without a paywall, are cited more often than equivalent articles behind subscription barriers. This has been studied across disciplines, across journals, across time periods, and the finding holds up. The first major study was by Steve Lawrence, published in Nature in 2001. Lawrence examined literature in computer science and related fields and found that online articles received an average of 7.03 citations compared to 2.74 for offline articles, an increase of 157%. He was careful not to claim causality. It could be that more important papers get posted online and get cited more, rather than the online posting causing the citations. But the correlation was striking. Subsequent research confirmed and refined the finding. A 2006 study of the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that papers published as immediate open access were 3 times more likely to be cited than papers available only by subscription. And they were cited earlier and more frequently over time. The mechanism seems clear. If more people can read your work, more people can cite your work. Removing access barriers increases use and impact. The overall growth of open access is also documented in increasingly granular ways. In 2015, roughly 22% of all newly published scholarly articles were available as open access. By 2023, that figure had risen to approximately 47%. Then, interestingly, it dipped slightly in 2024, possibly due to changes in how certain hybrid OA articles are categorized, highlighting the complexity of measuring open access at scale. The global digital publishing market has grown to approximately $97 billion in 2024. Gold OA articles are growing at 16% per year. PubMed Central now holds millions of full-text articles. Zenodo, CERN's open repository, holds billions of records across disciplines. But alongside these successes, the challenges are equally well documented. A PC equity gaps disadvantage researchers from lower income countries and institutions. Predatory journals corrupt the scholarly record and exploit researchers who need publication credits for career advancement. Publisher consolidation continues. 5 companies still control more than half the market, and their profit margins exceed 50% in some cases. Library budgets continue to be squeezed, and the rise of AI is introducing new quality concerns that the peer review system was not designed to address. The data tells a story of genuine, significant progress and of structural challenges that progress alone hasn't resolved. Open access is winning the argument, but winning the argument and fixing the system are different things. The evidence is clear on both counts. We've covered a lot of ground in this lecture series. Let me bring it together, not just as a list of points to memorize, but as a coherent story, because that's what it is. The story of scholarly communication is fundamentally a story about power. Who controls the production, distribution, and access to knowledge, and in whose interest that control is exercised? For centuries, the knowledge economy was controlled by learned societies and wealthy individuals who happened to also be the creators and consumers of scholarship. The system was exclusive, but at least it wasn't particularly exploitative. The expansion of research after World War II, which was enormously positive in terms of the amount of knowledge being produced, created the conditions for commercial publishing to step in. And commercial publishing optimizing for profit rather than for knowledge dissemination created the serials crisis, a system in which the people who generate research subsidize its capture by companies that then sell it back to the institutions that funded the research in the first place. It's a remarkable economic arrangement when you describe it plainly, and it's one that librarians were among the first to name and challenge. Open access emerged from that frustration, not as an attack on publishing, but as an argument that the internet made a better arrangement possible. The Budapest, Bethesda, and Berlin declarations of 2002 and 2003 defined what that better arrangement would look like. Immediate, unrestricted, perpetual access with proper attribution. Those definitions still hold, and every policy since has been measured against them. The transformation has been real and significant. More than 22,000 fully open access journals. Funder mandates covering the majority of US and European publicly funded research. Thousands of institutional repositories. Preprint servers that change the speed of scientific communication, most visibly during a global pandemic. Transformative agreements that are structurally shifting how institutions pay for publishing. These are not small changes, and yet the work is far from done. APC costs continue to climb. Publisher concentration continues. Inequity between well-resourced and under-resourced researchers and institutions remains profound. AI is introducing new challenges to research integrity that existing systems are not equipped to handle. And the scholarly communication system, for all its transformation, still operates largely on the incentive structure of 20th century academia, where prestige accrues to the journal brand and the institution rather than to the openness or impact of the work. For you, as current or future library professionals, the roles we've discussed are not peripheral. They are central. Selecting and acquiring resources that support open access, developing and managing repository content, facilitating discovery and access, preserving digital content for the long term, educating researchers about their copyright options, engaging in the public policy conversations that will shape the next generation of scholarly communication. The particular joy of this moment in library history, if I can call it that, is that librarians are not just managing a system, we are actively shaping it. The advocacy work of library organizations helped make the NOH mandate mandatory. Librarians at Harvard and elsewhere helped design and implement the first institutional OA policies. Library consortia are negotiating transformative agreements that are changing the economics of publishing at a global scale. Scholarly communication is being transformed, not by technology alone, not by funders alone, not by researchers alone, but by the sustained principled work of everyone in this ecosystem who believes that knowledge belongs to everyone. That includes you. And it always has.